Good morning and welcome to the annual Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary's Festival of African American Sacred History and Music. This is the 10th day of May in the year of our Lord 2021. It is good to see you and to have you join us today. This is a service, a festival really, a celebration of African American histories, African American music, many different genres, all followed by readings from the Book of Lamentations. I want to thank, first of all, Reverend Dr. Louie Bailey and the Reverend Dr. Amariah McIntosh for the impetus for this festival and for doing the yeoman's work to put together the readings and the music. African American history is distinctive in world history. We are a distinctive people in that we come from many of us come from the motherland, the continent of Africa. Some of us know from what area and country our people come from, and some of us do not. We are glad for that connection to the motherland and celebrate with you today the history of a people who have shaped this nation, the United States, in ways that historians and scholars are still discovering today in every area of human endeavor, scholarship, and achievement. African American history and music both find for many people in the world, especially persons who live with their backs up against the wall, solace, support, comfort, power, agency, vision, and a future. We celebrate the combination today of that sacred history and the music, which saves so many people for this world and for the world to come. We hope that you enjoy this festival and ask your blessing on the readers and the hearers of the word. Thank you.
Africans in the Americas from 1500 through 1540. For generations, we understood the history of the New World exploration and colonization, primarily as a set of experiences of both conquest and progress. More often than not, we believe these conquests resulted in the most dire of consequences for the primitive native populations that the first European explorers and settlers encountered and justifiably conquered or absorbed. While we cannot change what has already happened, we are duty-bound to restore to the historical record and the words of the human beings who collectively made that past. Today, we are sharing the role that persons of African descent have played in the creation of the saga of Western civilization. Now, it may come as a surprise to learn that African people played an essential part in this process of repeopling the Western Hemisphere from the very beginning. According to one source, Alonzo Pietro, the pilot of Columbus's ship the Nina in 1492, was a mulatto, a person of mixed black and white ancestry. And in 1502, the great Italian explorer was also accompanied by a black cabin boy named Diego. In 1504, groups of Africans began arriving in the Caribbean, and in 1508, Ponce de Leon took armed black men with him to conquer Puerto Rico. If not all of the first explorers and conquerors of New Spain were European, it is equally important to note that not all of the first Africans who assisted the Spanish and the Portuguese came as slaves. An untold number of free people of African descent also accompanied Spanish conquistadors. And as we might expect, their exploits were just as heroic and just as problematic as those of their fellow conquistadors. These Black conquistadors set an example for subsequent racial relations throughout the entire Spanish colonial experience, living their daily lives with degrees of complexity that rarely would be achieved by Black men and women in the early English settlements in both the Caribbean and in North America. They participated in the exploration of modern lands that would become modern day Mexico, Costa Rica, Honduras, Panama, Venezuela, Peru, Chile, and as well as Florida, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. From these experiences and through forced migration, as both slaves and free persons, these Africans could be thought of as founding fathers and representatives of the experiences of millions of Africans. And they would also become part of the New World, part of a transatlantic African people, and they would also become part of a people later known as African Americans. Lamentations 1 through 2. How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies.
Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Oh, don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace? Oh, deep river, Lord, I want to cross over to campground.
The World's Slavery Made, 1526 to 1763. In 1526, a large expedition left Hispaniola for Georgia, probably landing near Zampello Sound, the heart of Gullah country on the Atlantic coast. The settlement, known as San Miguel de Galde, included about 600 Spanish men, women, and children, and an undetermined number of African slaves, the first large group of slaves to arrive in lands that would become the United States. These black slaves may have been Atlantic Creoles, people of African descent from other Spanish or Portuguese colonies who had become Catholic either voluntarily, as those from the Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa, or forcefully converted as a result of their enslavement. They would have been black people who spoke Spanish fluently, were comfortable by culture, and who served as skilled tradesmen or domestics. Or they could have been unacculturated African slaves removed from their initial enslavement on the island of the Hispaniola and taken to Georgia to perform the most undesirable labor of their owners. New York Harbor saw a Dutch vessel from the West Indies anchor off of Manhattan Island in 1613 and deposit a mixed-race adventurer named Jan Rodriguez. He was a free man who lived on Manhattan Island for several months, marrying a Native American and apparently successfully serving as an intermediary between Native Americans and the Dutch. Africans thus were bound up in the history of New York as well as Florida and the early Southwest. In 1619, a group of 20 and odd Negroes landed at Jamestown, Virginia. Included in this number were slaves seized by a Dutch privateer off of a Portuguese vessel headed to the slave trading post of Vera Cruz. Seen through the lens of what today we call the Black Atlantic, the arrival of this tiny band of Africans in Jamestown in 1610 symbolizes a complex process that drew every European power, scores of colonial settlements, and hundreds of ethnic groups on 3 continents into an economic vortex that enriched both Europeans and African monarchs and merchants, helped spread both Christianity to Africa and Islam to the Western Hemisphere, and made the success of the fragile New World settlements possible. The transatlantic slave trade wrenched 12.5 million people from their Atlantic homes and dislocated them throughout the New World, reduced untold millions, moreover, many generations to a status of property, and did not end until Brazil finally outlawed the institution of slavery as late as 1888. The enslavement of the African people and their relocation to the New World commencing some 5 centuries ago, creating a breathtaking sweep of history that has proven to be one of the most consequential transformations of civilization in world history that shaped every country and every people touched by it. Just 40 years after the first 20 and odd blacks landed on these shores, all Africans arriving in Virginia were legally defined as slaves to be held in bondage for life. Slavery helped transform the 13 colonies from a scattering of vulnerable settlements into a rising economic power. That history, however, also proved harsh, tragic, and violent, inescapable conditions that shaped the course of American history. Lamentations 1, verses 16 through 18, the New Revised Standard Version. For these things I weep. My eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me, one to revive my carriage. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is no one to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should become his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you people, and behold my suffering. My young women and young men have gone into captivity.
Here soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. If you cannot preach like Peter, if you cannot pray like Paul, you can tell the love of Jesus and say he died for all. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal a sin-sick soul.
The Age of the Revolution, 1700 to 1811. From 1701 until the close of the legal slave trade in 1808, about 264,000 slaves were shipped directly from Africa to America's southern shores, which created imbalances between white and black populations of a very large body of slaves, in direct memory of African freedom. They sowed seeds of rebellion and revolution among African slaves. 1712 saw a slave rebellion in New York City, a major slave holding port. It was short-lived as 21 conspirators were captured and swiftly executed. The tense relations between slaves and their masters came to the head in 1739 with the Stony Oak Rebellion, considered the largest slave revolt ever staged in 13 colonies. It was not an isolated event and reflected the tension of the slave society in the making. Many slave uprisings took place in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, the Caribbean, and even New York City. Until Great Britain ended Spanish domination of Florida in 1763, the hundreds of free black people who lived there remained a powerful symbol and a serious threat to the English colonies. The Spanish governors offered freedom to any slaves who fled the Carolinas and Georgia, along with the Native American population in Florida, continuously battled the English to weaken their economy, which heavily depended on slave labor. One of the first underground railroads ran from Charleston, South Carolina, to St. Augustine, Florida. To exercise increased social control and prevent future threats, colonial legislators enacted new, harsher regulations designed to rivet the chains of slavery even tighter, virtually eliminate the possibility that the master could ever free a slave. Meetings among the blacks were outlawed from north to south. An accusation of a slave, whether true or not, was enough to guarantee the sentence to death. The time also brought about the cry of liberation of slaves and the abolition of the institution. The colonists were apparently oblivious to the contradiction of their assertions of freedom, liberty, and equally white being equally committed to the ownership of Africans. The American Revolution brought unprecedented opportunities for freedom and the possibility to forever alter the institution of slavery. However, a slave's best chance of securing liberty came from Britain rather than the new United States. In the Caribbean, Toussaint L'Ouverture led the successful revolt in St. Domingue in 1804, remained the new Black Republic Haiti. Fearing what it would do to blacks' quest for the freedom in the United States, President Thomas Jefferson refused to recognize the new government. For generations, standard American history downplayed the importance of the Haitian Revolution and its relationship both to African Americans, slave and free, and to the institution of slavery in the United States. For whites and blacks, Haiti became a source of powerful symbolism for revulsion. Lamentations 2:10-12, New Revised Standard Version. The elders of daughter Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust to their heads and put on sackcloth. The young girls of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with weeping, and my stomach churns. My bowel is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of my people. Because infants and babes faint in the streets of the city. They cry to their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" As they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom.
Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. No more weeping and wailing, no more weeping and wailing, no more weeping and wailing. I'm going to live with God. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. I want to meet my mother, I want to meet my mother, I want to meet my mother. I'm going to live with God. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. I want to meet my Jesus, I want to meet my Jesus, I want to meet my Jesus. I'm going to live with God. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God.
This is a redacted excerpt from Henry Louis Gates' More Rivers to Cross. For former slaves and their children freed after the American Revolution, the first years of the new century offered unprecedented opportunity. Free black people were able to create new worlds for themselves, north and south, rural and urban. In each section of the country, including the Midwest, which saw an even more complex mix of slavery and freedom, a surprisingly large range of responses to the challenges of carving out a life as an African American unfolded. The accomplishments of these years, intellectual, political, organizational, played a crucial role in forcing the issue of slavery to the forefront of national politics, creating the momentum that many years later would lead to emancipation. Free black communities emerged from the 18th century with vigor and a sense of possibility. In northeastern cities, free black people formed schools, Masonic lodges, and self-improvement societies, founded churches, owned homes, and started businesses. By the early 1820s, black community leaders had created a stunning number of institutions. However, black success attracted white resentment and opposition. Such resentment was a major factor in establishing the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in New York City. Also, during this period, Absalom Jones, who helped Richard Allen found the AME Church, became the first black Episcopal priest in America. In 1787, Prince Hall received a charter from the Grand Lodge in London, becoming the founder of the first black Masonic lodge in America and the oldest black institution in North America. Hall is also considered to have laid the foundation for the black abolitionist movement. By the 1820s, as the Reverend Hosea Easton painfully observed, while the country had been born with a fire for liberty, now a certain darkness had crept into the country's soul, and its drive for profit had made it insensible to those allied to you by birth and blood. Instead of enjoying the fruits and promise of liberty, millions of black people faced permanent racial slavery riveted to their future and that of their descendants. Those supposedly free enjoyed few, if any, freedoms that white men were bound to recognize. By the 1850s, as black voices from fugitive slave narratives poignantly and passionately articulated the horrors of slavery and the urge to be free, the country was coming apart over the issue of slavery. The white South, unalterably committed to slavery and its expansion, conducted undisguised war with the black community and its white anti-slavery allies in the North. In 1857, the Supreme Court affirmed in the Dred Scott decision that no person of African ancestry could really be an American citizen. The seeds of war were sown. Lamentations 2:18 and 19, from the New Revised Standard Version. Cry out to the Lord, O wall of daughter Zion. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite. Arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to God for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go. No more shall they in bondage toil, let my people go. Let them come out with Egypt's spoil, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go.
On February 12, 1865, Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., spoke to the nation from the U.S. Capitol, urging the nation to ratify a constitutional amendment to permanently end slavery in the United States. He explained, Congress must do and act until emancipation shall be followed by enfranchisement, and all men holding allegiance to the government shall enjoy every right of citizenship. The Civil War ended in April of that year, and the question whites asked, what is to be done with the former slaves? The short answer is that former enslaved African Americans wanted the same things that white people wanted. The real question centered on what actions whites would take to advance or restrict black freedom. Would justice and fairness guide their actions, or would they reestablish slavery but under another name? These former slaves, free from the constraints of plantation life, explored the parameters of their new freedom in countless ways, reorganizing their lives, families, and communities, even taking new names to signify that they were free men and women. They got married, established their own churches, sought out lost family members who had been forcibly separated from them during slavery. However, African American former slaves, especially those who remained in the South, confronted formidable obstacles. At the close of the war, most faced freedom without land, money, a home, and in some cases without clothes. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau in an attempt to mitigate the problems facing the former slaves and to negotiate labor contracts that would keep the slaves working, their former owners from bankruptcy, and all from facing ruin. With new civil rights legislation and 3 constitutional amendments, and some Northern whites advancing their cause, African Americans achieved unprecedented levels of equality. Whites, especially in the South, did all they could to keep this from happening. With the end of Reconstruction in 1876, the party of the former Confederacy, the Democrats, reinstituted white domination and virtual slavery with the infamous convict lease system. The gains of African Americans under Reconstruction were quite significant, but proved to be all too fragile. Faced with an astonishing array of social and political changes following the war, Southern whites resorted to an ever-escalating campaign of racist terror and intimidation. This time saw the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and other white domestic terrorist groups. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court continued its 20-year rollback of Reconstruction-era civil rights legislation. It authorized states to impose institutionalized segregation of the races on the premise that separate could be equal. This 1896 judgment gave full legal authority to segregation and stood as the supreme law of the land until the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. Lamentations 3:34 through 36. When all the prisoners of the land are crushed underfoot, when human rights are perverted in the presence of the Most High, when one's case is subverted, does the Lord not see it?
Free to dance, sing, free to lift my hands and worship. Lord, I'm free. Lord, I'm free. Free to dance, sing, free to lift my hands and worship. Lord, I'm free. Lord, I'm free. Said I'm free.
The Nadir and the Renaissance, 1890 to 1940. Starting in 1892, a teacher-turned-journalist, Ida B. Wells, co-owner of the Memphis Free Speech, used her paper as a platform to crusade against lynching by gathering statistics and collecting testimony. Ida B. Wells didn't just crusade against lynching. She also spoke to the tensions confronting African Americans in their new urban world, one that included competition for housing and jobs, often with poor white immigrants. She also focused on issues confronting women, especially African American women. Between 1910 and 1920, northern cities such as New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit saw an unprecedented explosion of growth in their Black populations. The Great Migration was one of the largest mass movements of citizens in American history, one that permanently changed not only African American society, but the larger American society as well. The arrival of Southern Blacks in such large numbers in the North exposed class, cultural, and political differences within the African American community and revealed competing views about how Black people could best navigate the era's obstacles. Jim Crow was more than a series of white-only signs. It was a way of life that approximated a racial caste system. With the outbreak of World War I, Black Americans wrestled with the question of whether to join the military and fight overseas in the name of freedom when the United States had done so little to protect their freedom at home. When the African American soldiers came home from Europe, any hopes that their patriotic service would earn them a better treatment were quickly dashed. There was a fierce and violent backlash to put Black World War I veterans back in their place. More African Americans died from white mob violence than from German bullets. The Harlem or New Negro Renaissance was a uniquely rich and vibrant cultural movement in the 1920s, when talented Black artists came together and produced an unmatched outpouring of creative work in literature, art, theater, and music. In the 1930s, the Depression hit Black America especially hard. African Americans remained divided about the way forward in a deeply segregated, sometimes violently repressive America. Some Black leaders urged patience, while others organized to push back against Jim Crow. Confronted by a new round of troubles, many African Americans turned to their religious leaders as they had for generations before. In response, some Black clergy combined spiritual guidance with political activism. The separation of the races demanded by Jim Crow would help to create the means of its destruction. The Black civic and religious organizations created by segregation would play a critical role in bringing down the whole rotten edifice. After Roosevelt's second election in 1936, African Americans embraced Roosevelt's policies of economic amelioration as well as his overtures to the Black community through his wife Eleanor and his body of informal Black advisors. World War II would turn out to be a crucial period of transition in American race relations. Lamentations, chapter 3, verses 46 to 50 from the New Revised Standard Version. All our enemies have opened their mouths against us. Panic and pitfall have come upon us. Devastation and destruction. My eyes flow with rivers of tears because of the destruction of my people. My eyes will flow without ceasing, without respite, until the Lord from heaven looks down and sees.
Good morning, LPTS family. Please join me in the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Let's sing it together, shall we? the chastening rod, felt in the days when home unborn, and died, yet with a steady beat, have not my weary feet come to the place from which our fathers sighed. We have come, made that tears as water. We have come, tread out blood slaughtered, out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far from the way, Thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the path of the lest our hearts troubled by the world forget thee, shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Rise, A People Emergent, 1940 through 1968. While the United States waged what the country officially portrayed as a righteous war in Europe against Hitler's hateful racial ideology, virulent racism ran rampant and unchecked at home. President Franklin Roosevelt had called for a world founded on 4 essential freedoms: freedom of speech and worship, and freedom from fear and want. Yet those basic freedoms remained far out of reach of many African Americans, whose lives were constrained by the fear of racist violence and the reality of crippling poverty and segregation. In the post-war era, the law was still most certainly not on the side of African Americans, and this was painfully evident on Southern buses. In the North, African Americans' protests against school segregation, unfair housing, and job discrimination had been building in intensity since the 1920s. In the segregated South, church groups, Black women's clubs, civil rights activists, and progressives had been fighting against the lynching and beating of Black men and the rape of Black women. In 1954, in a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated public schools violated the Constitution, holding that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate is inherently unequal. The unanimous decision represented the crowning triumph of the NAACP's patient legal strategy against state-sponsored segregation. The medium of television brought the ugly reality of segregation right into people's homes, and it offered civil rights activists engaged in the domestic battle for hearts and minds a powerful new tool. In August 1963, 250,000 people gathered in the nation's capital for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was here that Dr. King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech, calling on America to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. The passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965 outlawed discrimination in public accommodations on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, and gender. Despite all the protests and marches and passage of the Civil Rights Acts, in 1965, most African Americans were still barred from voting in the nation's southern states. John Lewis, the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, planned a march from Selma to the state capitol building in Montgomery to call attention to Black voting rights and register voters in Alabama. As people saw Bloody Sunday in their own homes, a surge of public support for the civil rights movement swept the country and the world, leading to a successful march and the passing of the Voting Rights Act, which ended literacy tests, poll taxes, and harassment of Black voters at the polls. In 1968, while in Memphis to support striking Black sanitation workers, Dr. King's life was ended by an assassin's bullet. 1 week later, President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1968, known as the Fair Housing Act. In retrospect, the death of Martin Luther King Jr. would mark the death of the modern civil rights movement. Lamentations 3, 58 through 60, New Revised Standard Version. You have taken up my cause, O Lord. You have redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause. You have seen all their malice, all their plots against me.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead
1968 to 2013, From Black Power to the White House. Stokely Carmichael's 1966 call for Black Power fit the mood of the times, both home and abroad, resonating with the anti-war movement in the United States and the revolutionary rhetoric of the newly independent post-colonial nations of Africa and Asia. Despite the gains of affirmative action, the backlash against African Americans started almost immediately. Federal and state programs meant to facilitate social and economic progress were dismantled before achieving their goals, leaving the poorest African Americans vulnerable to damaging forces. The post-civil rights era's optimism and African American unity began to be splintered by growing political and class differences and new social problems. Affirmative action initiatives were either stripped before they had been given a chance to work or were challenged and overturned in the courts. The urban poor found it increasingly difficult to break out of ghettos that grew more entrenched, hopeless, and dangerous in the face of a national recession and new social ills like crack cocaine and AIDS. With the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980, the Black underclass was essentially sidelined by policies that at best ignored them and at worst dismantled the progress that had been made in the community. Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty had been replaced by the war on drugs, incarcerating Black men and women and decimating Black families. A white man recorded the brutal beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1991 with a home video camera and sold the footage to a local television station. The story went national and then international. Just as innovations like the cotton gin in television had shaped the course of African American history, now the technological advance of inexpensive, readily available home video cameras revolutionized national awareness of the reality of police brutality against young Black men. The acquittal of the white officers triggered one of the worst riots in Los Angeles history. Hurricane Katrina in August 2005 continued to cast a harsh light on the glaring economic inequalities that seemed to have become permanently entrenched in 21st century America. The news footage of mostly Black people, living and dead, displaced and devastated, reminded the nation that the African American underclass was worse off than ever. Just 3 years after Hurricane Katrina, the election of Barack Obama as president amazed African Americans and the world. Many older people had never imagined that they would live to see a Black president in the White House. It must be noted that this most recent period can be characterized as the era of great achievement for African American women. In virtually every field of endeavor, women have risen in every field, from sports to politics. While no one could argue that we still have a very long way to go in terms of the full recognition of African American history and culture, it would be difficult to argue that American society has not made dramatic progress in this direction since the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the election and re-election of a Black president that speaks volumes about the growth of Black power. Perhaps building the bridge that will reach across these divides is the ultimate challenge of the next chapter in the history of African American people. Lamentations 5:19 through 21. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old.
We will overcome. We will overcome. We will overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we will overcome someday. We will live in peace. We will live in peace. We will live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we will overcome someday. God will see us through. God will see us through. God will see us through today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we will overcome someday. We will overcome. We will overcome. We will overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we will overcome someday.
The historical journey of persons of African descent in North America over the past 5 centuries has not been a smooth one. It has been marked by devastation and oppression, weeping and lament in a culture of white supremacy. As we reflect, we must attend to those injustices and their continuing legacies as we seek to build a more just world today. Yet we must also note the deep wells of resilience, courage, creativity, togetherness, faithfulness, pride, and power within African Americans and African American culture, especially as seen in the history of Black religion and music. So we celebrate today. We remember injustice and an arduous struggle of survival and resistance that continues even now. But this is a festival, a celebration. So we celebrate the symphony of life and resistance and imagination found in the sacred stories and songs of African American people. From the shores of Africa to Jamestown in 1619, to plantation slavery, to abolitionists and the Underground Railroad, from Reconstruction and the rise of the Black church to the days when lynching and Klan violence were at their height, from the Harlem Renaissance to civil rights, to Black Power, to President Obama and Black Lives Matter. The road has been a long one, but it has been filled with so many brave witnesses. Today, we celebrate all the saints, the ancestors, those who were there with Moses in Egypt land, and all those who have been witnesses for our Lord, the many names you've heard read aloud today. And we continue to lift every one of our own voices to sing together many of the songs that these witnesses sang too, as they sought to find and create meaning and beauty and joy in their lives and in their communities, even amid the most oppressive of conditions. Thank you all for joining us today as we celebrate and remember that journey and prepare ourselves to continue in God's work of justice and liberation.
And now for the benediction. God bless you and keep you. May God's face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May God's countenance be lifted upon you, and may you receive, both now and forever, God's peace. In Jesus' name, amen.